Welcome back to the Foxhole. I'm your host, James Rosen, coming to you from the Fox News Washington Bureau on Capitol Hill. With the airstrikes conducted Monday night in northern and eastern Syria by U.S. and allied Arab aircraft, President Obama has now launched, belatedly some say, the first kinetic military operations aimed at degrading and destroying the command and control headquarters of the terrorist army known as ISIS. Pentagon officials stress that these strikes will continue and that the overall multi-pronged effort to degrade and destroy ISIS as a whole will be a multi-year effort. Until this point, the commander-in-chief had faced sustained criticism on this front, not least following his own acknowledgement of late August that, quote, "we don't have a strategy yet." Emblematic of such criticism is the cover of the forthcoming November-December issue of The National Interest, the center-right foreign policy journal published by the Washington think tank The Center for the National Interest. As you can see, its headline reads simply, "Lost." And its lead article, entitled Saving Obama's Presidency, is written by Les Gelb, a figure who, as President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, is one of the country's most respected voices on foreign affairs. You'll also note, by way of full disclosure, my own name on the cover there at upper right for a book review I published in this issue. So, how did so cautious a president, a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, find himself so roundly criticized for his conduct on the world stage? Here with some answers. My friend, Jacob Heilbrunn, editor-in-chief of The National Interest and previously the author of They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons, published by Doubleday in 2008. Jacob Heilbrunn, thanks so much for stopping by the Foxhole.
Thanks.
All right, so first, before we get to current events, what basically, so people get the right idea about your book, what is the basic thesis of They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons?
Well, it traces the rise of several generations of foreign policy intellectuals who emigrated in the late 1960s and 1970s from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party and became the people we know as neocons.
Okay, and in my description of the journal of which you are the editor-in-chief, The National Interest, in my description of it as center-right, is that fair?
I think it is.
Okay. Are you yourself a neocon?
I think I used to be more of a neocon than I am now.
Okay, but you still truck with neocons?
I still do dine and have friendships with leading neocons.
All right. So, we meet at an auspicious point because of these airstrikes that were conducted overnight in Syria. First, what sense do you get of how effective they were, at least in this early stage of the mission, writ large? And do you think that they will do anything to quell the criticism that we've seen, as is typified on the cover of your magazine?
Well, the real problem with the airstrikes is that they had to occur at all. The case against President Obama is that he let this problem fester for several years, and here we are now confronted with monstrous events taking place in the Middle East, not only in terms of American national security, but also in terms of the upheaval and the massive refugee flows from Syria into Turkey and other countries.
Okay, so if we stipulate that there has been a big problem for a long time, and the President took a lot of heat over it in just the past 2 months, again, do you see these airstrikes doing anything to quell this criticism of him?
I think they will quell it initially, though there will still be people, our neocon friends, who will argue that the President is not going far enough, that if he was more aggressive, that it will take much more far-reaching steps to attempt to efface this menace.
And what's your view? Is he doing enough?
I think initially, yes. I would be somewhat cautious about sending in ground troops for 2 reasons. First, we've been there before. And
not in Syria.
No, but in Iraq. And the second is that the American public does not seem to have any appetite for a wide-ranging war that would include ground troops.
We hear that all the time. In fact, when I interviewed Secretary Kerry in Erbil in June, I made reference to the New York Times CBS News poll that was out that morning showing a great majority of Americans disapproving of the President's conduct of foreign policy. The Secretary of State said, "I don't do foreign policy by polls." But he then went on to tell me the American people don't want boots on the ground in Iraq. And, well, how can we know that the American people don't want that? The only way to know is through polls. So they like the polls they like, and they don't like the polls they don't like. But my question to you is whether the appetite of the American people for a given mission or objective, should that be the guiding principle on which we decide whether or not to undertake such missions or objectives?
Well, James, this is an old argument, and there's an interview with Henry Kissinger in the latest London Spectator where he argues that, or he complains and says that had only Watergate not occurred, then they would have been able to launch airstrikes and they would have been able to prosecute the Vietnam War and to save South Vietnam. The problem is the American public typically, at least from our record, The Korean War was unpopular. Dwight Eisenhower was elected by pledging to wind it down as quickly as possible. As Kissinger noted, we've lost essentially 4 of the last 5 wars we've been in since 1945. Our track record, the American public does not seem to have a willpower for sustained conflict that we confront in these third world areas. We're not fighting the World War II, the classic military battles anymore.
Has the United States yet shown that it can win an asymmetric war?
I am very wary of using the word win. I think we do have overwhelming military dominance in the entire world, not just in the Middle East. But it does seem like the most you can try to do is to cauterize the problem. That using a blowtorch, as we did in Iraq, seems to have rebounded in our faces. I do think that the ultimate origins of all of this was our invasion of Iraq and our lack of planning for an aftermath there.
Our guest in the Foxhole today is Jacob Heilbrunn, editor-in-chief of The National Interest and previously the author of They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons, published by Doubleday in 2008, and let the record reflect that it was Jacob and not me who was first to bring up Kissinger and Watergate in this conversation. Okay, so we've talked about the president's conduct in Syria and Iraq of late. Do we see these actions having any impact throughout the Middle East on, say, something like the Middle East peace process between the Israelis and Palestinians?
Well, in my view, there really is no Middle East peace process, and I'm not sure there can be one. The Palestinians are internally divided. In the last conflict in the Gaza Strip, I thought that what Israel did was absolutely necessary. And I don't really, you can complain about many of the things that Israel is doing, and I'm not a fan of the settlements, but I do not believe that there is a partner for peace on the Palestinian side right now.
Were that condition attended to, you then would believe in the advisability of a two-state solution?
That would be the optimal outcome. Whether that's really going to happen, I'm quite skeptical.
In our lifetimes?
I doubt it. I think this conflict is going to grind on and on because the Palestinians have not acknowledged to themselves that a good chunk of the population has not acknowledged, and the militants have not acknowledged, that they will not be able to defeat Israel. They still believe that they can drive the Jews into the sea, as it were.
The rise of Iran as a regional power and a menacing one to many of the other Arab, or the Arab countries, I should say, such as Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Jordan, has kind of made odd bedfellows of the Israelis and some of these Arab nations I just mentioned. And in previous years, previous decades, one gets the sense that those Arab nations would have been perhaps whispering to the Palestinians, in a sense, you can succeed. We can all together succeed in driving the Jews into the sea, to borrow your phrase. But now that the Israelis are kind of aligned with those Arab nations against Iran, do you get the sense that the Palestinians are no longer receiving such encouragements from those Arab nations?
This is true, but at the same time on the Golan Heights, we now have radical militants who are taking over there. And I believe that the Hamas and that the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian movement actually could become increasingly radicalized if they move towards the militancy, this fever that seems to be sweeping across the Middle East. What you're talking about, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, are the ancien regime, the old order that's trying to combat this revolutionary upheaval that's taking place in the Middle East. So I'm not confident that the Palestinians will actually come to grips with the obstacles and impediments that they face.
Do you sense that we are still in the early stages of what has been dubbed the Arab Spring?
Well, it is interesting because the Arab Spring began with that flush of optimism and the belief that democratization would take place in the Middle East. But one of the problems we had, of course, was that Hamas was freely elected in the Gaza Strip. When you do have elections, you sometimes embolden radical forces. And in Egypt, you had a return to autocracy. I think, yes, the Arab Spring has not come to an end, and unfortunately it seems to have issued in a kind of thermidor, in the French Revolution when things get really bloody.
So might we in fact take some encouragement from the fact that it's not over? This isn't the way the story ends. Perhaps there is some space for positive development or improvement.
Yeah, we can hope that. I mean, certainly, I think the key player here might be Saudi Arabia, which has been funding the Wahhabi militant faith around the globe. And the Saudis, in my view, are one of the chief promoters of this radical ideology that has mutated inside the Middle East.
And yet they participated in the Syria strikes, their Air Force, combined with ours.
We can only hope that the Saudis have finally seen reason. They've always played a double game, and they've tried to buy off and fund these militant groups. That day, I think, is coming to an end.
John Kerry, our Secretary of State, has made great efforts, or at least, shall we say, intensive efforts, toward securing some kind of Middle East peace deal, brokering something between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Some of the Arab diplomats I have spoken to have suggested that the Obama White House was not as enamored of the whole enterprise as Secretary Kerry was, and that it is almost privately referred to within the Obama White House as Kerry's folly. What sense do you get of the investment of the Obama administration in a Middle East peace process at this point, and what is your take on Kerry and the effort he's undertaken?
Well, I don't think Kerry ever really had the faith of the president, and I'm not sure how much confidence he even enjoys now.
Why do you say that?
Because I think the president, well, first of all, he was Obama's second choice as Secretary of State.
After Susan Rice.
Correct.
Okay.
And though Susan Rice, I think, would have been an utter disaster, I think Kerry is a much better choice. Kerry did valiantly pursue diplomacy in Israel. Everyone's scratching their heads, wondering why he was investing so much effort. Not surprisingly, it failed. I think Kerry's investing far less in the Middle East process now and much more in trying to construct a coalition to combat ISIS, which is an essential ingredient in fighting these terrorists and in trying to create ground troops that will fight the battle for us rather than the reinsertion of American military forces on the ground.
Our guest in the Foxhole today is Jacob Heilbrunn, editor-in-chief of The National Interest and previously the author of They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons, published by Doubleday in 2008. Let's shift gears from the Middle East to Eastern Europe, where we have witnessed over the past 6 or 8 months now this continuing crisis in Ukraine. The ceasefire there seems to be holding up for the most part, correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. What is your assessment of President Putin's near-term and long-term objectives here?
I think we have somewhat overestimated the Russian abilities and intentions. We've projected assets and abilities onto them that they may not necessarily possess. You read a lot that they're on the verge of taking over the Baltic states, or that they want to carve up the entire Ukraine. Now, in Ukraine, obviously, they could occupy the country fairly rapidly. I'm not convinced that Putin has ever had a master plan. I think if Obama had been on top of this and tried to work a deal with Putin earlier, or had worked more explicitly with the Europeans, that things didn't need to get to this stage where they are now.
So you think that the almost instant resort to sanctions was a mistake?
No, I don't think it was a mistake, but I would have upped it more sharply in the beginning, and I would have also tried to have more contact with the Russians. And I would not have ruled out the use of the military as Obama did as the crisis began. There was no reason to say anything. I would have just kept a silence about that.
In the early part of that crisis, we heard about several lengthy telephone calls between Presidents Obama and Putin. And one assumes that at a certain bureaucratic level, the Foreign Ministry and the Department of State continue their contacts more or less continuously. So why would you say that there wasn't sufficient contact?
Well, from what I've heard, and I could be wrong, but that there has not been that much contact between the two. And the people, someone that I've talked to on the NSC also just responded with an expletive when I mentioned Putin's name. I mean, I think the feelings are pretty raw.
There's a school of thought that says on the 1st of January 2014, Vladimir Putin did not imagine that at some point as the year unfolded he would be annexing Crimea. and that in fact he was doing this somewhat opportunistically in response to what he perceived to be Western meddling with his ally Yanukovych in Ukraine. There are others who say, look, the man is well documented on record as lamenting the decline of the Soviet Union, and what he's engaged in here is what Russian leaders have been engaged in for 400 years, which is a sort of acquisitive pursuit of kind of buffer territory. Which of those two schools do you subscribe to?
Both.
Right. Speaking of acquisitive.
I think he was, it fell into his lap, and he grabbed it. Once the upheaval took place in Ukraine, and he was able to depict it as an American-engineered coup, analogous, say, to the CIA toppling the government of Iran in 1953, or what we've done in Central America, whether that's true or not, he was able to depict events in that fashion. You had turmoil in Ukraine. You have nothing changing in Ukraine today. They seem to be in even worse shape than they were before Yanukovych was overthrown. What
went so wrong with the fabled reset of U.S.-Russian relations by the Obama administration?
Well, this is one the historians will pore over, and I suppose the finger-pointing will be on both sides. The skeptics will argue that there never was any hope of reaching an accommodation with Putin, and then the other side will argue that America should have been more accommodating toward Russian national interests, that we should have struck some kinds of deals with Russia of reciprocity to tie a deal with Iran and the Ukraine, you know, more in the Kissingerian mold.
I mean, Secretary Kerry still to this day talks about the cooperation the United States has received from Moscow on things like START 2, I think in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and, for example, the disposition of Syria's declared chemical weapons arsenal. And by all accounts, the enmity that has arisen over the Ukraine crisis has not seeped into the P5+1's work with the Iranian nuclear negotiations. But you don't foresee that the final 2 years of the Obama administration can possibly bring about some improvement in the state of things between the U.S. and Moscow now, correct?
You could have mild improvement. It would probably take actually a conservative Republican president to be able to...
Why do you say that?
Because Obama would be seen as an appeaser and a feckless weakling. He would certainly be lambasted by conservatives if he made any movement towards Putin at this point.
A final question about President Putin. There is a tendency, I think, in the West and in the United States to see Vladimir Putin as essentially a tyrant or a dictator of limitless power, of unchecked authority in his own sphere. But I wonder if you would suggest that perhaps Putin is better seen as, albeit a very powerful figure within his system, but nonetheless an actor within a system, and an actor who does face some kind of constraints from institutions or interest groups within that system, or is that kind of a fantasy vision of him?
No, I think that's true. I mean, the Soviet Union is not Stalinist Russia in 1936. You had tens of thousands of people marching this past weekend to protest.
You mean Russia is not? You said the Soviet Union.
Sorry, Russia. A slip of the... Russia is not the Soviet Union of the 1930s. You had the marchers this weekend protesting Russian actions in Ukraine. Putin does not have... He has a strong propaganda machine inside Russia, but there is still a dwindling liberal opposition to him, and then you have the business interests as well. Depends how far he wants to go and how much it turns into a true Cold War. The worse relations get between the two sides, the more likely it is, I think, that you'll have increasing repression inside Russia.
Our guest in the Foxhole today is Jacob Heilbrunn, editor-in-chief of The National Interest, and previously the author of They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons, published by Doubleday in 2008. Let's turn briefly to domestic politics. Do you take note of this kind of schism within the Republican Party now on foreign affairs with respect to what might be called, on the one hand, non-interventionism, which some call isolationism, and I don't know what the other side would be called, interventionism or idealism, or...
I think it's really I would call them the rollback fashion after the 1950s when this doctrine developed inside the Republican Party, that it wasn't enough just to have a static military confrontation with the Soviet Union. You needed to win it and Barry Goldwater was one of the first to announce that.
Sure.
So people like Ted Cruz or others are more rollback concerned. They want to go in the offensive. And then people like Rand Paul are more heirs to that Robert Taft wing. I wouldn't call them isolationists, but they're interested in projecting American power. But they're not interested in democratization or in endless wars abroad.
Do you get the sense that any of the potential candidates on the right, on the Republican side, has a leg up over any of the others in terms of winning the nomination?
That's a really tough call because you don't even have Jeb Bush announced. Rand Paul does seem to have a fighting chance. I think Chris Christie, who will be much more interventionist, also has a strong chance to make a comeback.
You do?
Yes.
You don't think that this whole situation in New Jersey has mortally wounded him?
It's wounded him, but it's not mortal. It came at the right time. He's got enough time to recover. And
would you personally be comfortable with President Hillary Clinton?
I am not a huge fan of Hillary Clinton.
She disagreed with President Obama on the question of whether to arm the Syrian rebels, and she's made that very plain since leaving the administration, right?
Right. Well, she's tried to document her deviations from what the administration actually prosecuted while she was in office.
To any effect?
I think that she has got herself into hot water.
Why?
Because, well, among Democrats, she was perceived as disloyal to Obama, and as not as a traitor, but as once again trying to be a pragmatist and turning on someone who had perhaps not been her benefactor, but certainly assisted her political rise by appointing her Secretary of State.
Our guest in the Foxhole today has been Jacob Heilbrunn, editor-in-chief of the National Interest, and previously the author of They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons, published by Doubleday in 2008. That's something we have in common. My book was published by Doubleday in 2008.
That's right.
I dare say yours sold better, and for that I continue to resent you. Jacob Heilbrunn, thanks for visiting the Foxhole today.
Thanks, James.
A pleasure to have you. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. I'm your host, James Rosen, signing off from the Washington Bureau of Fox News. You can follow me on Twitter @JamesRosenFNC. We'll see you next time.